This is BBC World News America. Reporting from Washington, I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. Turkey in turmoil, how the country's currency crisis is weighing on world markets as relations with Washington get worse. In Yemen, thousands of people attend funerals for the children killed in last week's bus attack as questions linger on how it happened. And a battle of tweets and tapes, how a war of words between President Trump and a former advisor is hotting up. Welcome to World News America. The financial impact of Turkey's crumbling currency is spreading, with global financial markets on edge after the lira hit new record lows. The country's president has accused the United States, its NATO ally, of stabbing it in the back after the Trump administration imposed sanctions late last week. Well, now let's speak to our correspondent Çil Kasabolu from the BBC's Turkish service, who is in London for us. Thanks very much for joining us. Now, of course, Turkey and the US are NATO allies, but how dire is the relationship between the two countries now?
Well, yeah, the tension is pretty high between the two countries. On top of the sanctions the US imposed on Turkey, two of the Turkish ministers, Donald Trump also doubled up the tariffs on steel and aluminium this week. And on top of everything, now Turkey says that the US is waging economic war against Turkey, and that this crisis now has nothing to do with economy, but rather has political motivations. So, and the crisis between Turkey and the US goes back to their disagreement over Syria and over some other issues, including S-400 missile that Turkey is planning now to buy from Russia. And of course, as a NATO member, both of those countries now depends, and the crisis in Turkey depends on the better relations that both needs to build up.
And how is this affecting ordinary Turkish citizens? Obviously, their currency is plummeting. What is the economic impact there now?
Well, yes, the ordinary citizen, now we can say that overall, in average, 20% of their purchasing power has been cut off. And there are calls by Mr. Erdogan saying that Turks need to convert their dollars into liras under the mattresses. But of course, this is not what the investors want to hear. And especially on social media, we hear people complaining about the current crisis, fearing of losing their, or being forced to shut down their businesses, especially those who rely on imported goods. They say they have to raise the prices. And of course, this doesn't really resonate with the Turkish people.
Çil, thank you very much for joining us from our London studio. Now, Donald Trump's been lashing out at a former advisor who secretly recorded tapes of her own firing from the White House, including a conversation with the president himself. Mr. Trump's labelled Omarosa Manigault-Newman as wacky on Twitter. She was a contestant on the president's reality show The Apprentice and lasted about a year in the Trump administration. The BBC's North America editor John Sopel has more.
Omarosa Manigault-Newman had zero policy expertise and absolutely no political experience when she was appointed by Donald Trump to be one of his senior advisors at the White House. But she had been on The Apprentice, the reality TV show that he'd hosted. They were the perfect coupling.
I like Omarosa. Omarosa's a good person.
She's also black in a White House that lives up to its name as being, well, very white.
Donald Trump is a con.
And with her firing and book that she's now touting, the reality TV genre has come to the White House. In the book, she accuses the president of being a racist and misogynist. He fired back.
Lowlife. She's a lowlife.
But revenge is a dish best served cold, and she has planned this all out, extraordinarily with a tape of her firing by Chief of Staff John Kelly.
Can I ask you a couple of questions? Is the president aware of what's going on?
Let's not go down the road. This is a non-negotiable discussion.
I don't want to negotiate. I've never had a chance to talk to you, General Kelly.
Yeah,
So if this is my departure, I'd like to have at least an opportunity to understand.
We can talk another time. This has to do with some pretty serious integrity violations.
That drew gasps in the West Wing. The firing took place in the Situation Room, a place where no recordings are ever allowed. That was yesterday. Today, Omarosa had a new tape to play. Donald Trump feigning ignorance about the dismissal.
Omarosa, what's going on? I just saw on the news that you're thinking about leaving. What happened?
General Kelly came to me and said that you guys wanted me to leave.
No, nobody even told me about it. Nobody.
Wow.
You know, they run a big operation, but I didn't know it. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
God damn it. I don't love you leaving at all.
And now Donald Trump has come out swinging. Wacky Omarosa, who got fired 3 times on The Apprentice, now got fired for the last time. She never made it, never will. She begged me for a job, tears in her eyes. I said, OK. The flippant response would be to say, well, this is all good, harmless fun. But this is the West Wing, the nerve centre of the most powerful country on earth. And while dramatists have always sought to depict politics as soap opera, the real thing is coming up with more bizarre plot lines than any scriptwriter would dare imagine. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
More script lines indeed. Well, for more on all of this, I'm lucky to be joined by Niall Stanage, Associate Editor at The Hill newspaper. Niall, as John was saying there, I mean, every day we hear something that is more implausible, but then it's actually real life at the White House. Now, Omarosa was very close to Donald Trump. She's trying to sell a book. How credible is she, though? She's close to him, but is she just trying to flog copies of her book?
Certainly that's what the White House are saying, that this is all about publicity. And they do have some things to lean on in making that argument. Omarosa, whenever Donald Trump was running to be president, was hyper-loyalist, suggesting on one famous occasion that critics would bow down before him after he won. So it's quite a U-turn that she has made. Having said that, she does have these tapes, so obviously to that extent those are factual artefacts.
And she's promising more tapes with potentially more explosive revelations. I mean, is there anything, though, that could be released on tape that could damage the president, given that during the election they were damaging tapes that didn't damage him? I
think it's less about any one revelation, Rajini, and more to this idea of chaos in the West Wing that John alluded to in his report. The issue here is not really any specific tape. It's an issue of judgment, of having someone like Omarosa Manigault-Newman in the White House in a senior position, while she is, for example, apparently making covert recordings in the Situation Room, a room that is supposed to be one of the most secure in the United States.
And you talk about disarray in the White House. Omarosa isn't the only person who is leaking. I mean, the president has railed against people leaking from inside his White House. How wide is this issue or problem?
I think the problem of factionalism within the White House remains. When John Kelly came in as Chief of Staff, he was charged with bringing that under control, and he did curb it to some extent. But there are still a lot of different people in the administration with their own agenda. They have no reticence at all about pushing that agenda, and this is something that even Omarosa has referenced, the idea that you need to have your own back because there are 13 or 17 knives being readied to plunge into it at any given moment.
And just briefly, speaking of firings, FBI official Peter Strzok's been fired from his role today for being disloyal to President Trump. Who is he and why does this matter?
Well, he's an FBI agent who was involved in this matter of the Clinton investigation. It matters because it goes to the Trump camp's argument that there was bias involved in the investigation. The problem is that others are arguing that he shouldn't have been fired, that the firing itself is evidence of political pressure being brought to bear. So it's a development, but I think it's one that fits into existing narratives for both sides.
All this talk of firing makes me think of a certain reality TV show.
Absolutely.
Niall Stanage, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Virginia.
Now, thousands of Yemenis have attended a mass funeral for the children who were killed in an airstrike by the Saudi-led coalition last week. At least 29 children were among those who died in the attack on a bus in the northern city of Sada. The BBC's international correspondent, Orla Guerin, sent us this report.
Coffin after coffin borne aloft. The unbearable weight of the lightest bodies, little boys killed on their school bus. These are the victims of what Saudi Arabia has called a legitimate airstrike against Houthi rebel fighters. But it was youth and innocence being buried here today. Even for Yemenis inured to bloodshed and suffering, this is a devastating loss. And on the streets of the rebel stronghold of Sadr, grief and rage against the Saudis and their Western allies. Your brutality has been exposed to the world, said the rebel leader Mohammed al-Houthi, and this crime will not be forgotten. But the outcry in Yemen is not echoed by the British government.
Our silence on this is deadly for Yemeni civilians. It basically suggests to the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition that they continue doing whatever they want with total impunity. So far from the UK government, all we've had is a solitary tweet. A tweet from a Minister of State saying, we express concern about the deaths of 29 children, and that's a disgrace. We should be out there condemning this.
Britain backs the Saudi-led coalition which intervened in Yemen 3 years ago to restore the internationally recognised government to power. There are UK personnel in the coalition's command and control centre. The Ministry of Defence says it's a very small number and they have a purely advisory role. But Britain is one of the major arms suppliers to Saudi Arabia, and campaigners say the value of arms sales to the Saudis has increased by almost 500% since the conflict began. Over the past 3 years, that trade has earned Britain around £4.6 billion. The Saudi-led coalition has promised to investigate the carnage on the school bus, which amounts to investigating itself. Experts say don't expect the probe to produce any changes and don't expect London and Washington to lean on Riyadh.
Britain and even the United States have a limited ability to put pressure on the Saudi authorities, in public at least, because at the moment Riyadh is extremely touchy. The Middle East as a whole is fairly unstable, and these are very important contracts for US and particularly British firms at a time when the aviation industry in particular is under a lot of pressure in the UK.
For Zayed Tayyib, all that matters is that 3 of his sons are gone, brothers killed side by side and now buried that way. As Zayed was saying his goodbyes, we asked the government for an interview. No minister was available. Orla Gearan, BBC News.
Now let's take a look at some of the day's other news. South Korean President Moon Jae-in is to visit the North Korean capital next month to meet Kim Jong-un. It'll be the first time in more than a decade that a leader from the South has visited Pyongyang. Mr. Moon and Mr. Kim have already met twice this year for summits as dialogue between the neighbours grows. Aretha Franklin is seriously ill, according to a person close to the veteran soul singer. The 76-year-old cancelled concerts earlier this year due to health concerns and was ordered by doctors to take rest. Miss Franklin's an 18-time Grammy winner and one of the best-selling artists of all time. NATO and US forces in Afghanistan insist the city of Ghazni not come close to falling to Taliban militants as fighting raged there for a 4th day. Officials instead described the assault as a failed attack. Afghan officials say 100 of their personnel have been killed, along with almost 200 Taliban fighters. Meanwhile, a senior US diplomat recently held the first direct talks with the Taliban. Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale reports now from Helmand province.
Back to the dust and heat of Helmand. This the place where hundreds of British troops were killed and which nearly fell to the Taliban when they departed. 4 years ago, the British left for good, but the Americans soon returned, albeit in smaller numbers. Now they're on their own, patrolling what was the sprawling British base of Camp Bastion.
It was necessary for us to come back in here a couple of years ago. If that had not happened, I would imagine that that Helmand would be pretty solidly under the control of the Taliban right now.
At night, US Marines fire illumination rounds to deter any attack, as well as lethal long-range artillery rockets to target enemy positions. By day, they oversee the training of the Afghan army. And these soldiers need all the help they can get. Their units already suffered heavy losses.
The Corps right now is sitting at about 30% for manning.
30% of what it should be?
Yes, that's correct.
Strange. That's a worry, isn't it?
It is, but there's time in recruiting, constant advising, and the senior leadership will improve the situation.
We joined the Afghan army out on patrol on the main highway through Helmand. This the road regularly targeted by Taliban roadside bombs. But our escorts seem more interested in their entertainment along the way. They still don't always look or sound like a professional army.
The Afghan army is now leading the fight, but they are well below strength, suffering high rates of attrition, whether through casualties or desertions. And they're still only just able to secure central Helmand, where most of the population live.
Britain may have turned its back on Helmand, but it does have a presence here in the capital, Kabul. On the ground, British soldiers have been tasked with transporting international advisors safely round the city. It's this mission, dubbed Armaduba, that's being boosted by another 440 UK troops. It's still America that's doing the heavy lifting. But it's talking, not fighting, that will change the course of this war.
This does take time. It's going to require sustained commitment. And as we move now much more into training and assist and capacity building, nobody's talking about fighting their way to victory anymore. Victory now is a political settlement, and that is more than ever on the cards.
A recent three-day ceasefire has brought a glimmer of hope, now followed up by preliminary talks between the US and the Taliban. But there's still no peace process. And for these Afghan soldiers, there's still no end in sight to 17 long years of war. Jonathan Beale, BBC News, Kabul.
You're watching BBC World News America. Still to come on tonight's programme. A look at what's wrong with America's school system from someone who would know. We speak to former US Education Secretary Arne Duncan after this. China says that reports it's holding 1 million Muslim Uyghurs in detention in Xinjiang province are completely untrue. The denial follows concerns raised at a UN panel in Geneva that the region resembles a massive internment camp. China said Uyghurs enjoy equal freedom and rights, adding those deceived by religious extremism would be assisted by resettlement and re-education. Stephen McDonald has more.
The Chinese government is making no apologies for the way it's running Xinjiang. It has told the UN that there's been a major crackdown there in order to rein in violent Islamic extremism and those who would separate Xinjiang from the rest of China. Now, critics of the policy, though, say that a lot of ordinary Uyghurs are being caught up in this very same crackdown. However, the Chinese government again says this is not being targeted at any ethnic group and is not designed to in any way stop people from practicing their normal religious beliefs.
Now, our education system runs on lies. Well, those are the words from President Obama's Education Secretary Arne Duncan, who oversaw the country's schools for the better part of 6 years. His new book, How Schools Work, look at the so-called lies he thinks undermine America's school system and the unintended consequences that can come with attempts to reform it. Well, Secretary Duncan joins me now. Thanks very much for coming into the studio.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
First of all, tell us what those lies that you write about are.
There are a few of them. We all say we value education, but none of us across the political spectrum vote on education. And we don't hold politicians at the local level, at the state level, at the national level accountable for increasing access to pre-K, or raising high school graduation rates, or making college more accessible or affordable. We all say we value teachers, but we don't pay teachers as professionals. We don't train them as professionals. We don't give them the kind of mentoring and support that they need. And maybe the toughest one is I honestly think we in America don't value our children. And we value our guns more than our children. We don't keep them safe. And we've raised a generation of teenagers on mass shootings, on gun violence. And thankfully, teenagers are challenging that very vociferously themselves.
Now, you mentioned there about frustration and teachers not being valued. We saw earlier this year in the state of Oklahoma teachers going on strike, saying that they don't have enough resources or support. You can't lay the blame squarely at the current administration because it's a long-term thing. So did your administration do things wrong to get to the point where teachers in this country feel they're not well-resourced?
Yeah, well, funding in states like that actually come from the state level. So whether it's Oklahoma or West Virginia, the honest answer is that those are states that are led by Republican governors. And too often their idea is to starve public education, to cut funding. And I don't think that's fair to teachers. I don't think that's fair to our children. I don't think that's good for our nation in terms of its long-term health as a democracy and our economy. So seeing those teachers stand up and fight, not so much for their own salary, but to give their children, their students, access to better education, I was actually really proud of that.
And your book's obviously a reflection of your 6 years in office. Were there things you could have done better yourself, though?
Oh, there are many things we could have done better. I desperately wish we could have got immigration reform done so that we could give students who were undocumented a chance to go to college and receive college financial aid. After the horrific Sandy Hook massacre, in which 20 students and 5 teachers and a principal were killed, were slaughtered, we had to get something done in terms of gun control legislation, and we weren't able to persuade our Republican friends in Congress to partner with us to make not just our schools, but our nation safer. So those are huge regrets I have, but the biggest regret is not keeping our kids safe and allowing them to grow up as children, free of fear and free of trauma.
Now, you've dedicated quite a lot of your book to the issue of gun violence in schools. What is the solution?
Well, to be clear, it's not gun violence in schools. Our schools are generally some of the safest places our children ever are. It's really gun violence in America. And this is a made-in-America problem. It doesn't happen in the UK. It doesn't happen in Canada. It doesn't happen in Australia, where my wife is from. We have simply lacked the political will as a country to do the right thing. So this is a lack of common sense, a lack of courage. It's not intellectually difficult. And to see young people from across the country, led by the students from Parkland, Florida, kids we're working with in Chicago, stepping up and saying, we're not going to accept this reality. I'm so proud and so thankful for their leadership.
Interesting times in education. Secretary Duncan, thanks for coming in.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, a story from the intersection of technology and medicine. Artificial intelligence is proving to be as accurate as some of the world's leading experts when it comes to diagnosing eye disease. That's according to research by a leading hospital in London and the Google company DeepMind. Our medical correspondent Fergus Walsh reports.
You know, it's quite bright, but...
On the brink of going blind, Elaine's sight was saved by doctors at Moorfields Hospital. This scan showed she needed urgent treatment.
There's a growth of abnormal blood vessels under the retina.
Now artificial intelligence, machines, have learned how to interpret these complex images. A computer analysed 1,000 patient scans using a set of rules, an algorithm, and was able to detect over 50 eye conditions and did not miss a single urgent case.
This is a jaw-dropping result, and I think that it will make most eye specialists gasp because, you know, we have shown that this algorithm is as good as some of the world's leading experts in interpreting these scans.
So you look on the green cross.
Using artificial intelligence to diagnose eye disease could be a game changer. That's because at present doctors are swamped by the number of scans they have to read, and some patients go blind before they get treated.
I can see the leaves, the detail isn't sharp.
200 people a day in the UK, like Elaine, develop the blinding form of age-related macular degeneration. She only has vision in her right eye,
and welcomes the advent of artificial intelligence in healthcare. Google's London headquarters is home to its artificial intelligence company DeepMind. They developed the algorithm to read eye scans and are researching AI's use in other health conditions.
We're looking at eye disease, but we're also looking at how you would plan radiotherapy treatment, because it can take specialists up to 8 hours to plan a treatment currently for complex cancers, and also whether we can use artificial intelligence to identify breast cancers more effectively and potentially earlier through mammography screening.
Artificial intelligence is set to have a profound impact in healthcare, speeding up diagnosis and freeing up clinicians to spend more time with patients. But not everyone will be happy with a tech giant like Google having access to their health data. So the people at DeepMind will need to ensure that patient confidentiality and data protection are embedded in everything they do.
That was the BBC's Fergus Walsh reporting there. Artificial intelligence taking over every area of our life. Well, that's all we have time for. I'm Rajini V on Twitter at BBC Rajini V. Thanks very much for watching us. Join us again soon.